In the autumn of 1888, 5 women walked the gaslit streets of London's East End, each carrying the weight of poverty, each seeking the coins that would buy them a bed for the night. Mary Ann Nichols, 42 years old, her marriage collapsed behind her. Annie Chapman, 47, suffering from illness, crocheting flowers when her hands were steady enough. Elizabeth Stride, 45, a Swedish immigrant with stories of shipwrecks that may or may not have been true. Catherine Eddowes, 46, her initials tattooed in blue ink on her forearm. Mary Jane Kelly, believed to be around 25 years old, the youngest, whose real name we may never know. Within 10 weeks, all 5 would lose their lives in the darkness of Whitechapel's narrow lanes and courtyards. They would become forever linked not by their lives, but by the manner of their passing, by the unknown hand that took them, by a name scrawled in red ink on a letter that may have been nothing more than a journalist's invention. Jack the Ripper, the name that would echo through history, while the women themselves faded into footnotes, their struggles forgotten in the shadow of a killer's legend. You're tuned to the Velvet Obscura. Tonight, we open another case. This is a story drawn from police reports, inquest testimonies, and newspaper accounts from 1888. It's a story of real women who lived real lives in desperate circumstances, and of a city that failed them long before a killer found them in the dark. As we move through the fog of Victorian London, I invite you to let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. And if these voices from the past speak to you, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It helps us continue opening these forgotten cases. Now, settle in. Let the modern world fade. We're walking backward through time, through more than a century of history, to a London that no longer exists except in faded photographs and yellowing documents. The year is 1888, and the largest city in the world is about to become acquainted with a new kind of fear. London, in the autumn of 1888, was a city of staggering contradictions, a metropolis that contained within its boundaries both the pinnacle of Victorian achievement and the depths of human misery. With a population exceeding 6 million souls, it stood as the largest city on Earth, the beating heart of the British Empire, a place where wealth and innovation flourished in the western districts, while poverty and desperation festered in the east. The River Thames divided more than geography, it separated worlds. In the West End, gas lamps illuminated grand boulevards where carriages rattled past theaters and music halls. New restaurants opened their doors to the wealthy and the aspiring middle classes. Concert halls rang with music. The Queen herself, Victoria, had sat upon her throne for over 50 years, giving her name to an age of supposed progress and moral certainty. But venture eastward, past the ancient walls of the city of London, and you would find a different reality entirely. The East End sprawled across the landscape like a wound that refused to heal. It had begun as a collection of villages and hamlets beyond London's eastern boundary, places with names like Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, and Stepney. The Industrial Revolution had transformed these areas into something altogether darker. Factories had sprung up, their chimneys belching black smoke into skies that rarely saw clear sunshine. Slaughterhouses lined the streets, their gutters running with blood and offal. Tanneries, breweries, and foundries filled the air with chemical stenches that burned the lungs and watered the eyes. The docks drew people like a magnet draws iron filings. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, Irish fleeing famine, Jews escaping pogroms in Eastern Europe, people from across the globe seeking opportunity in the empire's capital. What they found instead was overcrowding on a scale that defied comprehension. By 1888, approximately 900,000 people called the East End home, with 250,000 crammed into Whitechapel alone. The housing stock, never designed for such numbers, buckled under the pressure. Families lived in single rooms, sometimes 8 or 9 people sharing a space barely large enough for one. These weren't homes in any meaningful sense. They were places to collapse after exhausting days of labor, assuming work could be found at all. The streets themselves became extensions of these cramped quarters, filled day and night with hawkers selling everything from matches to flowers, with children playing in gutters that served as open sewers with men and women who had nowhere else to be. The common lodging houses, or doss houses as they were known, offered the only alternative to sleeping rough. For 4 pence, the price of a loaf of bread, you could rent a coffin bed in a shared dormitory. For 2 pence, you could lean against a rope stretched across a room, allowing yourself to doze upright through the night. The rope would be cut at dawn, spilling its human cargo onto the floor, their rest purchased, and their time expired. These establishments numbered over 200 in Whitechapel alone, housing more than 8,000 people each night. Approximately 15,000 residents of Whitechapel were classified as homeless, wandering the streets or finding shelter where they could. The workhouses, those Victorian institutions designed to assist the destitute, were regarded with such horror that many preferred to take their chances on the streets. The work was brutal, the food barely sufficient to sustain life, and the separation of families was enforced with rigid cruelty. In such conditions, crime flourished like mold in darkness. Petty theft was so common as to barely merit mention. Street robberies happened in broad daylight. Gangs controlled certain territories, extracting protection money from shop owners and lodging housekeepers. Violence, particularly against women, was woven into the fabric of daily life. A woman might be beaten in the street, and passers-by would simply step around a scene, considering it none of their business. The Metropolitan Police estimated that 1,200 women in Whitechapel engaged in prostitution, though this number was likely conservative. These women weren't the glamorous courtesans of French novels. They were desperate souls, often older, frequently battling alcohol dependency, sometimes suffering from disease. They sold their bodies for pennies, just enough to secure a bed for the night or a meal to quiet their hunger. Many worked sporadically, turning to prostitution only when other means of earning money dried up. They might clean rooms in lodging houses, pick hops in Kent during harvest season, or crochet flowers to sell on street corners, resorting to the streets only when these legitimate avenues failed. The darkness itself was different in 1888. Electric lighting remained a novelty, found only in the wealthiest areas. Whitechapel relied on gas lamps, their flickering flames casting pools of yellow light separated by vast stretches of shadow. The side streets, the alleyways, the courtyards that honeycombed the district were pitch black after sunset. A person could stand mere feet away from you and remain completely invisible. Louis Diemschutz, who would later discover one of the victims, had to strike a match just to see what lay in front of him. And even then, the feeble light barely penetrated the gloom. The streets themselves were filthy beyond modern imagination. Sheep and cattle were herded through Whitechapel on their way to slaughter, leaving trails of dung in their wake. Residents threw their refuse directly into the streets. Raw sewage ran in the gutters. The smell was overwhelming, a constant assault of rotting meat, human waste, coal smoke, and the sickly sweet stench of the tanneries that processed animal hides. This was the world into which Jack the Ripper stepped. Not a world of innocent victims plucked from safety, but a world where violence and death were familiar companions, where women disappeared and few questions were asked, where the desperate and the predatory existed side by side in the shadows. Marianne Nichols never expected a life would end as it did, though perhaps she should have. She was born Marianne Walker on August 26, 1845, the daughter of a locksmith. Her early life showed promise. She married William Nichols, a printer's machinist, and together they had 5 children. For a time, they lived a respectable, working-class existence, the kind of life that Victorian moralists held up as the ideal for those of humble birth. But something went wrong between Marianne and William. The exact nature of their troubles remains unclear, lost in the contradictory accounts given after her death. William claimed she deserted him. Her father insisted William was the one who left. What is certain is that by the early 1880s, their marriage had collapsed entirely, and Marianne found herself alone, separated from her children, trying to survive in a city that offered few opportunities for a woman in her position. English law at the time required a husband to support his estranged wife financially, and William dutifully paid Marianne 5 shillings a week. It wasn't much, but it kept her from absolute destitution. Then he discovered she was engaging in prostitution. The law contained a provision that freed a husband from his obligation if his wife was earning money through immoral means. William stopped the payments, and Marianne's situation deteriorated rapidly. She drifted through various workhouses and lodging houses, occasionally finding employment as a domestic servant, but never managing to hold these positions for long. Her later years were marked by a pattern of brief stability, followed by collapse. She would find work, perhaps even a live-in position that came with a bed and meals, only to lose it weeks or months later and return to the streets. Alcohol likely played a role, as it did for so many in her circumstances, a temporary escape from a reality that offered little hope. By August 1888, Marianne Nichols was living at 18 Thrall Street in a common lodging house. She shared a bed with another woman, Ellen Holland, both of them paying their 4pence when they could scrape it together. On the night of August 30th, Marianne found herself short of the required amount. The deputy keeper of the lodging house turned her out at 1:30 in the morning, sending her back onto the streets to earn the necessary coins. At 2:30, Ellen Holland encountered her friend on the corner of Osborne Street and Whitechapel Road. Marianne was intoxicated, swaying on her feet, her speech slurred. Ellen tried to convince her to come back to the lodging house, but Marianne refused. She gestured vaguely down the street and said she would soon have her DOS money. She was wearing a new bonnet, she told Ellen, and seemed pleased with this small acquisition. The two women parted, Ellen heading back toward Thrall Street, Mary Ann continuing east along Whitechapel Road. That was the last time anyone saw Mary Ann Nichols alive, at least anyone who would later come forward. Slightly more than an hour later, at approximately 20 minutes to 4 on the morning of Friday, August the 31st, a cart driver named Charles Cross was walking along Bucks Row on his way to work. The street was quiet, lined with warehouses and a board school, the buildings dark and silent in the pre-dawn hours. In the dim light, Cross noticed what appeared to be a tarpaulin lying on the pavement near the entrance to a stable yard. He walked closer to investigate. It wasn't a tarpaulin. It was a woman, lying on her back, her skirts raised almost to her stomach. Cross couldn't tell in the darkness whether she was dead or merely unconscious, perhaps drunk and passed out where she fell. He heard footsteps approaching and called out to the figure. Another man named Robert Paul, also heading to work. Together they bent over the woman, Paul placing his hand on her chest and feeling what might have been a slight heartbeat, though he couldn't be certain. They decided to find a policeman. Walking quickly away from Bucks Row, they encountered Constable Jonas Misen on his beat and reported what they'd found. Misen hurried to the scene, but by the time he arrived, another officer, Constable John Neal, had already discovered the body on his own rounds. Neal had lit his lamp and seen immediately what Cross and Paul had missed in the darkness. The woman had suffered severe injuries to her throat and body. Blood still seeped from wounds, spreading in a pool around her shoulders. Her eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the sky. When the police surgeon arrived and examined the body more thoroughly, they discovered that the violence hadn't stopped with her throat. Her body had been opened with deep wounds. The cuts appeared to have been made with deliberate downward thrusting motions. Mary Ann Nichols was identified by the workhouse mark on her petticoats and later confirmed by individuals who knew her from the lodging houses. The inquest, conducted by coroner Wynne Edwin Baxter, attempted to piece together her final hours and determine who might have been responsible. The medical evidence suggested she had been attacked where she was found, that her assailant had positioned her on the ground and injured her throat from left to right, possibly standing behind or beside her. The abdominal injuries had been inflicted after her passing. But who had done this and why? The police had no clear suspects. There were no witnesses to the actual attack. No one had heard screams, though the board school was occupied by a caretaker and his family, and warehouses on the street had night watchmen. Whoever was responsible had worked in near silence, completing their terrible business and disappearing into the darkness without raising an alarm. The press seized upon the story, but at this point, it was treated as a single, particularly brutal case in a district where violence was common. What no one yet realized was that this was only the beginning. Annie Chapman was born Eliza Ann Smith in September 1841, making her 47 years old in the autumn of 1888. She had married a coachman named John Chapman, and like Mary Ann Nichols, she had children and for a time lived a respectable life. But also like Mary Ann, her marriage collapsed, and she found herself navigating the harsh realities of life as a single woman in Victorian London. Annie struggled with chronic illness and poor health, which left her weak and often unable to work. She supplemented whatever money she could earn by selling flowers and crocheting antimacassars, those decorative cloths Victorians draped over furniture. When these legitimate means of earning money failed, when her illness prevented her from working, she turned to walking the streets late at night to earn the fourpence needed for a bed. She lived at Crossenham's lodging house at 35 Dorset Street, one of the most notorious addresses in Whitechapel. Dorset Street was sometimes called the worst street in London, a place where even police officers were reluctant to venture after dark. The lodging houses that lined it were overcrowded and filthy, their residents among the most desperate in the district. By early September, Annie's health had deteriorated markedly. She had been involved in a fight with another woman at the lodging house, sustaining bruises to her chest and temple. She was weak, her breathing labored, her body failing. On the night of September 7th, she returned to Crossingham's but couldn't pay for her bed. The deputy keeper, Timothy Donovan, turned her away at 1:30 in the morning. Annie told him not to let her bed. She would be back soon with the money. She was seen leaving the lodging house and walking towards Spitalfields Market. Like Mary Ann Nichols before her, she went out into the night to earn the coins that would buy her shelter. At approximately 5:30 on the morning of Saturday, September 8th, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, a man named John Davis, descended the stairs to the backyard of his building. Number 29 was a 3-story house that had been subdivided into multiple dwellings, housing 17 people in total. The backyard, like many in the area, was small and enclosed by a wooden fence, accessible through a passage that ran alongside the building. Davis opened the back door and immediately saw Annie Chapman's body, lying on the ground between the steps and the fence, only a few feet away. She was on her back, her head near the house, her legs drawn up, her clothing disturbed. Her face was turned toward the fence. Davis didn't approach closely. Even from the doorway, he could see something was terribly wrong. He ran into the street, found 2 men, and gasped out that there had been another incident. The police arrived quickly, and the scene they encountered revealed violence that exceeded what they had seen at Buck's Row. Annie Chapman had suffered severe injuries. Her throat had been deeply cut, but the attacker hadn't stopped there. Her body had been opened and violated in ways that suggested deliberate purpose rather than random attack. Parts of her had been removed and disturbed with grotesque intent, placed around the body in a manner that showed the killer had spent time at the scene. The post-mortem examination revealed even more disturbing details. Internal organs had been removed entirely and taken from the scene by the killer. This wasn't random violence. This was something else. Something that suggested the killer may have had at least some knowledge of human anatomy, enough to locate and remove specific parts, even in the darkness of a Whitechapel backyard. At the inquest, a witness named Elizabeth Long testified that she had seen Annie Chapman at approximately 5:30 in the morning, standing outside 29 Hanbury Street, talking to a man. Long described him as being over 40 years old, a little taller than Chapman. of dark complexion, wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat. She heard the man ask, "Will you?" and heard Annie reply, "Yes." Long walked on, thinking nothing of the encounter beyond noting it as one of the many transactions that took place on Whitechapel streets. If Long's testimony was accurate, Annie Chapman was killed within minutes of being seen with this man. The murderer had led her into the backyard passage, cut her throat, mutilated her body, and removed organs, all in near silence and in a location where 17 people slept on the other side of thin walls. No one heard anything unusual. No cry for help, no sounds of struggle. The killer worked and departed like a ghost. The newspapers now began to make connections. 2 women, both found with their throats cut, both mutilated, both killed in the early morning hours in Whitechapel. A pattern was emerging, and with it came theories and speculation. One name that circulated through the district was Leather Apron, supposedly a local man, possibly Jewish, who carried a knife and extorted money from prostitutes. The press published descriptions of this figure, many of them playing on crude anti-Semitic stereotypes, and tensions in the already fractious community began to rise. The police arrested a man named John Pizer, a Polish Jew who worked as a bootmaker and was known by the nickname Leather Apron. But Pizer had alibis for the times of the murders and was quickly released. The real killer, whoever he was, remained at large, and women in Whitechapel began to fear the darkness in new ways. Some tried to stay off the streets after midnight. Others had no choice, their need for money overriding their fear. September wore on. The police increased their presence in the district, but the maze of alleyways and courtyards made effective patrolling nearly impossible. Vigilance committees formed, groups of local men who walked the streets at night looking for suspicious behavior. The Lord Mayor of the City of London and several private citizens offered rewards for information leading to the killer's capture. Despite all this activity, no credible suspects emerged. By the end of September, some people began to hope that perhaps the murders had stopped, that the killer had been scared off by the increased police presence or had left the area entirely. Then came the night of September 30th, and all such hopes evaporated. Elizabeth Stride was born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden on November 27, 1842. She emigrated to England in 1866, arriving in London at age 23, seeking a better life than her homeland could offer. In 1869, she married John Thomas Stride, a carpenter, and the couple seemed to settle into a stable existence. But John died in 1884, and Elizabeth found herself alone in a foreign country, her Swedish accent marking her as an outsider, her prospects limited. She took various jobs, cleaning rooms in lodging houses, doing needlework, whatever she could find. She lived with a man named Michael Kidney, on and off for several years, a relationship marked by arguments and separations. Kidney would later claim she left him periodically to drink, which may or may not have been fair characterization. Elizabeth told people different stories about her past, sometimes claiming she and her husband had lost children in a disaster, sometimes describing a shipwreck. The truth of her earlier life remained elusive, obscured by the stories she told and the losses she suffered. By September 1888, Elizabeth was living at 32 Flower and Dean Street, another lodging house in the heart of Whitechapel. On the evening of September the 29th, she was seen by various acquaintances around the district. She appeared to be in good spirits, cleaned the rooms at the lodging house to earn her bed for the night, and went out later in the evening. Multiple witnesses reported seeing her at different times, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of men, conducting the business that kept her alive. At approximately 10 minutes to 1 on the morning of Sunday, September 30th, a man named Louis Diemschutz was driving his pony and cart into Dutfield's yard, a narrow courtyard that led off Berner Street. Diemschutz was a hawker who sold cheap jewelry, and he used the yard to stable his pony. It was dark, the yard unlit, and as his cart turned into the entrance, his pony shied to the left, refusing to proceed straight. Diemschutz climbed down and struck a match. In the feeble light, he saw a shape on the ground near the wall of the International Working Men's Educational Club, a Jewish anarchist organization that occupied the building alongside the yard. Diemschutz touched the shape with his whip and realized it was a person. He hurried into the club where a discussion was underway and called for help. Several men rushed out with candles and lamps. The light revealed Elizabeth Stride lying on her left side, her throat severely cut, blood still flowing from the wound. She clutched a small packet of kashus, breath-freshening sweets, in her left hand, suggesting she had been attacked so suddenly that she hadn't had time to drop them or defend herself. Unlike the previous victims, her body showed no other wounds. Her clothing hadn't been disturbed. The attacker had injured her throat, and apparently nothing more. The police would later develop a theory that Diemschutz's arrival had interrupted the attacker. The freshness of the blood and the warmth of the body suggested Elizabeth had been killed only moments before discovery. It's possible the killer might have been mere feet away in the darkness when the cart turned into the yard, might have fled while Diemschutz was inside the club raising the alarm. If this theory holds any truth, then the person responsible had been denied the opportunity to complete what the previous cases suggested was his pattern, to inflict the extensive injuries that seemed to be his purpose. If this theory was correct, investigators believed at the time he would likely seek another victim that same night. Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old, born in Wolverhampton but raised in London after her family relocated there when she was young. Both her parents died when she was a teenager, and she and her siblings were separated. Catherine returned to Wolverhampton for a time, but eventually came back to London, where she met Thomas Conway, a former soldier. They lived together for years, perhaps married, though no record has been found, and had 3 children together. Catherine had his initials, TC, tattooed in blue ink on her forearm. Conway was a teetotaler, and Catherine's drinking eventually drove them apart. He left her, and she took up with a new man, John Kelly, who became her companion for the last 7 years of her life. They earned money where they could, sometimes traveling to Kent for the hop harvest, sometimes hawking goods on the streets, sometimes begging. Catherine occasionally turned to prostitution when money was especially tight. On the afternoon of September 29th, Catherine was arrested for being drunk and disorderly on Aldgate High Street, where she had been entertaining a small crowd with her antics. The police took her to Bishopsgate Police Station to sleep it off in a cell. She was released at approximately 1 o'clock on the morning of September 30th. The custody officer asked if she had anywhere to go. She said she did. Though this is likely not true, she was released out into the night, walking east from the police station toward Houndsditch and then Mitre Square. Mitre Square was a small, enclosed square in the City of London, which meant it fell under the jurisdiction of the City of London Police rather than the Metropolitan Police. 3 passages led into the square, which was surrounded by warehouses and commercial buildings, all closed and dark at that hour. A night watchman, George Morris, was on duty in one of the buildings, but he was inside, unaware of what was happening in the square outside. At approximately 25 minutes to 2, 3 men walked through one of the passages that led into Mitre Square. One of them, Joseph Lowend, later told police he had seen a man and woman talking at the entrance to another passage, Church Passage. The woman had her hand on the man's chest. Lowend didn't pay much attention, assuming it was simply another prostitute with a client. A common enough sight. He described the man as being approximately 30 years old, of medium build, wearing a peak cap and a dark jacket. This description would become one of the most detailed the police would receive of anyone who might have been the killer, though it remained frustratingly vague. 14 minutes later, at 1:45 in the morning, Constable Edward Watkins walked into Mitre Square on his regular beat. He had passed through the square at approximately 1:30 and found it empty. Now, 15 minutes later, he found Catherine Eddowes. She lay in the corner of the square, her injuries severe and extensive. Her throat had been cut deeply. Her face had been damaged, her features altered by the attack. Her body had been opened from the breastbone downward. Internal organs had been disturbed and displaced. Investigators later determined that her uterus and left kidney had been removed and taken from the scene. The violence inflicted exceeded anything seen in the previous cases. The killer had worked quickly, accomplishing all this in less than 15 minutes, probably less than 10, in a location where a police officer might walk through at any moment. Constable Watkins blew his whistle, and soon the square was full of police officers. They searched the area but found no one. The killer had vanished once again, this time carrying portions of Catherine's body with him. The investigation that followed revealed something else, a clue that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, roughly half an hour after Catherine's body was discovered, Constable Alfred Long was walking along Goulston Street, about a third of a mile from Mitre Square. He found a piece of blood-stained fabric on the ground in the doorway of a building. The fabric was later identified as a section of Catherine Eddowes' apron, cut or torn from the garment she had been wearing. The killer had evidently used it to wipe blood from his hands or his knife. Above the apron piece, written in chalk on the wall of the doorway, was a message. The exact wording was disputed, with different officers recording it differently. But the most commonly cited version read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of this message, if it indeed had any meaning, remains debated. Some interpreted it as an anti-Semitic slur. Others thought it might be meaningless, the scrawlings of someone unconnected to the murders. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren made a decision that would be criticized for decades afterward. Fearing that the message would inflame anti-Semitic sentiment and lead to riots, he ordered it erased before it could be photographed. The only records of the message are the written accounts provided by officers who saw it, accounts that don't entirely agree on the wording. Whether the graffito had any connection to the killer or was merely a coincidence, a message already on the wall when the killer happened to discard the apron piece cannot now be determined. What was certain was that the killer had murdered 2 women in less than an hour in 2 different locations, evading capture both times. The press dubbed this the double event, a phrase that would take on additional significance when letters began arriving that referenced it specifically. On September 27th, 2 days before the double event, the Central News Agency in London received a letter. It was addressed to The Boss, Central News Office, London City, dated September 25th, and written in red ink. The agency initially treated it as a hoax, one of many that had been arriving since the murders began, but they forwarded it to Scotland Yard on September 29th for the police to evaluate. The letter was boastful and mocking in tone. The writer claimed to be the murderer and taunted the police for their inability to catch him. He referenced a joke about someone called Leather Apron, which had been widely reported in the press. He stated his intention to continue killing, saying he was down on whores and wouldn't stop ripping them until he was caught. He wrote that he loved his work and wanted to start again. He mentioned saving blood in a ginger beer bottle to use as ink, but finding it had gone thick like glue, so he was using red ink instead. Then came the sentence that would give the killer his name. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers. Just for jolly, wouldn't you? The letter was signed, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. The police were skeptical, but kept the letter. Then, after the double event, when Catherine Eddowes was found with part of her right earlobe cut away, the letter suddenly gained credibility. Had the writer genuinely predicted this detail? Or was it coincidence, the ear damage incidental to the other facial mutilations? On October 1st, the police released facsimiles of the letter to the press, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting. That same day, another piece of correspondence arrived at the Central News Agency, this time a postcard rather than a letter, written in similar handwriting and also in red ink, this time with what appeared to be bloodstains. The postcard was postmarked October 1st, and its message referenced the double event explicitly. I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip, it read. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not the time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. The writer called himself Saucy Jackie, and this postcard seemed to contain details only the killer would know. That 2 women had been murdered. That one of them, presumably Elizabeth Stride, had not been mutilated like the others, possibly because the killer had been interrupted. The timing also seemed significant. The postcard was postmarked on October 1st, but the murders had occurred in the early morning hours of September 30th. Had the writer sent the postcard immediately after the killings? The publication of these letters had several effects. First, they provided a name that captured the public imagination. Jack the Ripper was simultaneously playful and sinister, more memorable than the Whitechapel murderer. The name stuck, appearing in newspaper headlines across Britain and eventually around the world. Second, they inspired a flood of hoax letters. Hundreds of people, some seeking attention, others playing cruel jokes, sent letters to the police and newspapers claiming to be the killer. Sorting through this correspondence became a nightmare for investigators, consuming time and resources that might have been better spent elsewhere. The third, and most importantly, they raised questions about authenticity that have never been satisfactorily answered. Were the letters genuinely from the killer, or were they hoaxes? In the years following the murders, several police officials stated their belief that the letters were written by a journalist seeking to keep the story alive and sell newspapers. In 1931, a journalist named Fred Best reportedly confessed that he and a colleague had authored the Dear Boss letter and Saucy Jackie postcard, choosing the name Jack the Ripper themselves. However, this confession came decades after the fact and cannot be independently verified. A forensic linguistic analysis conducted in 2018 concluded that the Dear Boss letter and Saucy Jackie postcard were written by the same person, based on distinctive linguistic patterns and word choices. However, this analysis could not determine whether that person was the killer or a hoaxer. The question remains open, and with it, the question of whether the killer ever actually communicated with anyone, or whether the name Jack the Ripper was created by someone entirely unconnected to the crimes. One more letter deserves mention, though it was different from the others. On October 16th, George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local men who patrolled the streets, seeking to assist the police, received a small package. Inside was a piece of human kidney, partially preserved, and a letter written in a notably less educated hand than the Dear Boss letter. "From hell," the letter began. "Mr. Lusk, so I send you half the kidney. I took from one woman, preserved it for you to the piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody niff that took it out if you only water well longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk." The kidney was examined by doctors who concluded it was a human kidney, likely from an adult female, and that it showed signs of Bright's disease, a kidney condition. Catherine Edhouse's remaining kidney, still in her body, also showed signs of the same disease, leading some to conclude that the sent kidney had indeed come from her. However, the medical evidence was not conclusive, and some doctors argued that the kidney could have been obtained from a hospital or medical school. The From Hell letter, unlike the Dear Boss letter, was never considered a likely hoax by police, but neither could they prove its authenticity. The autumn of 1888 grew colder. October passed with no new murders, at least none that were clearly the work of the Whitechapel murderer. Tensions remained high in the East End. The police continued their investigation, but appeared to be making no progress. Commissioner Warren, under intense criticism from the press and the public for his force's failure to catch the killer, resigned on November 8th. His resignation was announced the following day, November 9th, the same day that Mary Jane Kelly was murdered. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the canonical victims, her age uncertain, but believed to have been in her mid-20s, though we cannot be certain because so little is reliably known about her. Unlike the other victims who were in their 40s and had lived in London for many years, Kelly appeared to be younger and had arrived in the East End more recently. She told different stories about her past to different people, and separating fact from fiction has proven impossible. According to Joseph Barnett, the man she had been living with until shortly before her death, Kelly claimed to have been born in Limerick, Ireland, that her father's name was John Kelly, and that her family had moved to Wales when she was young. She said she had married a collier named Davies who died in a mining accident. She said she had come to London and worked briefly in a high-class brothel in the West End before ending up in Whitechapel. But none of these claims could be verified, and it's possible Kelly invented or embellished her history, perhaps making herself more interesting to the men she met, perhaps trying to create distance between her current circumstances and whatever her past actually held. What is known is that by 1888, Kelly was living at 13 Miller's Court, a small room accessed through a passage off Dorset Street. The room was sparse, containing a bed, a table, and little else. She had been living with Joseph Barnett, a fish porter, but they had quarreled and he had moved out on October 30th. Barnett would later say the argument was about Kelly allowing other women, prostitutes, to sleep in the room, though it's also possible they simply couldn't afford the rent together any longer. Kelly fell behind on her rent after Barnett left. By November 9, she owed 29 shillings, a substantial sum for someone in her position. On Thursday, November 8th, she was seen around the area drinking in pubs trying to earn money. A witness named Mary Ann Cox saw her return to Miller's Court around 1:45 in the company of a man Cox described as short and stout, shabbily dressed, carrying a pail of beer. Cox heard Kelly singing in her room after this, a song called "A Violet from Mother's Grave," and other residents of Miller's Court reported hearing singing at various times through the night. The last confirmed sighting of Mary Jane Kelly alive was around 2 o'clock in the morning of November 9th, when another resident saw her standing in the doorway of her room, apparently alone. After that, there is only speculation about what happened in the hours that followed. At 11:15 on the morning of November 9th, Thomas Bowyer, an assistant to Kelly's landlord, knocked on her door. He had been sent to collect the overdue rent. When there was no answer, Bowyer reached through a broken window pane, pushed aside a coat that Kelly had hung as a makeshift curtain, and looked inside. What he saw sent him running to find his employer. The police were summoned, but they decided to wait for bloodhounds that Commissioner Warren had been training, thinking the dogs might be able to track the killer's scent from the scene. The bloodhounds never arrived, possibly because Warren's training program had encountered difficulties, and it wasn't until 1:30 in the morning afternoon that the door was finally forced open and the full extent of what had happened inside was revealed. Mary Jane Kelly had suffered injuries far more extensive than any of the previous victims. The killer had spent considerable time with this victim, far more time than he'd had with any of the others. Every previous incident had taken place outdoors in locations where the killer risked discovery at any moment. Here, behind a closed door in a private room, he had been free to act without fear of interruption. The scene was severe beyond anything the investigating officers had encountered in their careers. Her injuries were so extensive that Kelly was difficult to identify. Her face had been damaged to the point that recognition was nearly impossible. Investigators document that her body had been opened entirely, with internal organs removed and displaced around the room. The walls showed evidence of what had occurred. By all accounts, from those who entered the room, the scene was beyond anything they had witnessed. Joseph Barnett was brought to identify the body, but he could only do so by her eyes and ears, the only parts of her that remained recognizably hers. The inquest was brief, with the coroner limiting the scope of the proceedings to the basic facts of the death and identification. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder by person or persons unknown. Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon, examined Kelly's body and wrote a detailed report. In it, he connected this murder to the 4 previous ones, those of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, arguing that all 5 showed sufficient similarities in their modus operandi to be the work of one person. This report, dated November 10, 1888, is one of the foundational documents linking these 5 murders together as the work of a single killer. And then, after Mary Jane Kelly, the murders stopped. Or more accurately, the murders that could be confidently attributed to the same killer stopped. There were other murders in the area in the years that followed, some bearing superficial similarities to the Ripper's work, but none that convinced investigators they were dealing with the same perpetrator. The police investigation into the Whitechapel murders was hampered from the beginning by factors both within and beyond their control. The Metropolitan Police in 1888 operated without many of the tools modern investigators take for granted. There was no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis, no forensic laboratories. The primary methods of investigation were witness statements, physical evidence from the crime scenes, and the hope that someone with knowledge of the crimes would come forward. The detective force was also severely understaffed. As Commissioner Warren had noted in a report to the Home Office shortly before the murders began, the rapid growth of London's population and building stock had outpaced the expansion of the police force. The detective department was particularly stretched thin, with fewer than 300 officers, including inspectors and sergeants, covering the entire Metropolitan Police District. Overall command of the investigation was given to Detective Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who coordinated inquiries from Scotland Yard. On the ground in Whitechapel, Inspector Frederick Aberline led the investigation. Aberline was a logical choice, having spent 14 years working in the area before being promoted and transferred the previous year. His knowledge of the district and its criminal elements was considered invaluable. The police pursued various lines of inquiry. They conducted extensive house-to-house searches, particularly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. They investigated local butchers and slaughtermen, thinking the killer's apparent anatomical knowledge might indicate experience with animal slaughter. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on countless tips, and arrested numerous suspects, only to release them when their alibis checked out or the evidence against them proved insufficient. The investigation was complicated by jurisdictional issues. The Metropolitan Police had jurisdiction over most of London, but the City of London, the ancient square mile at the city's heart, had its own separate police force. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square, which was in the city, meaning her murder fell under City of London police jurisdiction. While the two forces cooperated, they maintained separate investigations, and information wasn't always shared as efficiently as it might have been. Political tensions also hampered the investigation. Commissioner Warren and Home Secretary Henry Matthews had a contentious relationship, disagreeing on policy matters and on how to handle the intense public scrutiny the murders generated. Warren's decision to erase the Goulston Street graffito without photographing it, made out of fear of anti-Semitic violence, was one of several controversial calls that attracted criticism. The darkness of Whitechapel worked in the killer's favor. The poorly lit streets and myriad alleyways provided countless places to hide, countless escape routes. Based on how the cases unfolded, the killer seemed to know the area well, able to navigate the maze of passages even in pitch darkness. It's also possible he understood police patrol patterns, as he appeared to strike at times in places where he could work unobserved and then disappear before officers arrived. These are patterns that investigators noted at the time, though whether they represented genuine knowledge on the killer's part or simply fortunate timing remains uncertain. Despite deploying additional constables in plain clothes, despite the vigilance committees formed by local residents, despite the rewards offered for information, the police never identified a definitive suspect. They developed theories, investigated individuals who came to their attention through various means, but never found sufficient evidence to charge anyone with the murders. Years later, in 1894, Sir Melville Macnaghten, who had become Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, wrote a memorandum in which he named 3 men as potential suspects. This document, which exists in multiple versions, was written to refute claims made in the press that a man named Thomas Cutbush was the Ripper. In dismissing Cutbush, Macnaghten offered his own thoughts on who the killer might have been. The first man he named was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who had apparently taken his own life in the Thames at the end of November 1888. Druitt's body was found on December 31st, 1888, having been in the water for several weeks. Macnaghten wrote that Druitt was said to be a doctor and of good family, though in fact Druitt was a barrister, not a doctor, which suggests Macnaghten's information may not have been entirely accurate. Macnaghten claimed to have private information suggesting that Druitt's own family suspected him of being responsible for the crimes, that he was sexually insane, and that his death came shortly after the last canonical incident. The case for Druitt as a suspect is weak when examined closely. He was dismissed from his teaching position at the end of November, 3 weeks after Mary Jane Kelly was found, and appeared to be functioning normally in the weeks following that event. He worked as both a barrister and a teacher, making it difficult to see when he would have had time to commit attacks in Whitechapel. No direct evidence links him to the crimes beyond the timing of his death. Some researchers have suggested it's possible that Druitt's dismissal from his teaching job and subsequent death might have been related to his personal life rather than to any violent acts, though this remains speculation without definitive proof. The second suspect McNayton named was Kosminski, described as a Polish Jew who lived in Whitechapel, who suffered from insanity caused by solitary vices, who harbored a great hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and who had strong tendencies toward violence. MacNaughton wrote that Kosminski was removed to a lunatic asylum in March 1889. Later research identified this man as Aaron Kosminski, born in Poland in 1865, who immigrated to England with his family in the early 1870s. He worked as a hairdresser and lived in Whitechapel. By 1890, he was showing signs of serious mental illness, experiencing auditory hallucinations, and developing a paranoid fear of being fed by other people. He was admitted to an asylum in 1891 and would spend the rest of his life institutionalized, dying in 1919. Some senior police officials, including Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, wrote in later years that they believed the killer was a Polish Jew who was identified by a witness but could not be prosecuted because the witness, also Jewish, refused to testify against him. It's been theorized that they were referring to Kosminski, though the details in their accounts don't entirely match what is known about him from asylum records. The case for Kosminski is also problematic when examined critically. While he did live in Whitechapel and did suffer from mental illness, the nature of his condition doesn't seem entirely consistent with the calculated violence seen in these cases. He was described as harmless in the asylum, his illness manifesting as paranoia and auditory hallucinations rather than violent impulses. The only recorded instances of him displaying violence were once brandishing a chair at asylum attendants and allegedly threatening his sister with a knife on one occasion. Modern forensic psychologists have noted that the type of disorganized, paranoid individual Kosminski appears to have been would be unlikely to commit such methodical acts, and then if he had, to remain silent about them while institutionalized. However, this represents a modern psychological profiling applied retrospectively to limited historical records, and such analysis cannot be considered definitive. In 2014, an author claimed to have DNA evidence linking Kosminski to the murders, based on tests performed on a shawl allegedly taken from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. However, this claim has been widely disputed by scientists who point out that the chain of custody for the shawl cannot be verified, that mitochondrial DNA can be shared by thousands of people, and thus cannot definitively identify a specific individual, and that the study methodology has been questioned. The journal that initially published the research later issued an expression of concern after the authors couldn't produce their original data. The third man McNagden named was Michael Ostrog, described as a Russian doctor and convict who was frequently confined in asylums as a homicidal maniac. Ostrog was indeed a real person, a con man and thief who used numerous aliases. However, research has found no evidence of any violent crimes in his record, only fraud and theft. Furthermore, author Philip Sugden discovered that Ostrog was actually in prison in France for petty offenses during the time of the Ripper murders. making him an impossible suspect. These three men became known as the prime police suspects, largely because McNaughton's memorandum mentioned them, and later researchers took his assertions at face value. However, it's important to note that McNaughton did not join the police force until 1889, after the murders had ended. He had no direct involvement in the investigation and no access to information that the officers actually working the case lacked. His memorandum represents his personal opinions based on reviewing case files years later, not official police conclusions. Over the decades since the murders, more than 100 different people have been proposed as suspects, ranging from plausible individuals who lived in the area at the time to wildly implausible theories involving members of the royal family, famous artists, or American serial killers who happen to be visiting London. Some theories are based on careful research and circumstantial evidence. Others are pure speculation or actively ridiculous. None have been proven. The truth is that we don't know who was responsible for the events that took the lives of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. We likely never will. Too much time has passed. Too much evidence was lost or never collected in the first place. Too many of the people involved are long gone. The case remains officially unsolved. The impact of these events extended far beyond the 5 women who lost their lives. The intense media coverage of the case, both in Britain and internationally, brought unprecedented attention to conditions in the East End. For decades, social reformers had been warning about the poverty and squalor in which hundreds of thousands of Londoners lived. But their warnings had largely fallen on deaf ears among the wealthy and the powerful. The Whitechapel incidents changed that. George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and social critic, wrote sarcastically in a letter to the Star newspaper on September the 24th, 1888, commenting on how the violent events had accomplished what years of peaceful activism had not, by forcing the comfortable classes to acknowledge the existence and conditions of the East End poor. The national conversation about poverty, housing, and social reform that followed led to concrete legislative changes. The Housing of the Working Classes Act of 1890 and the Public Health Amendment Act of 1890 both set new minimum standards for housing and living conditions, directly responding to the public outcry generated by the case. The murders also had a lasting impact on how serial killers are perceived and discussed in popular culture. Before Jack the Ripper, there was no real concept of the serial killer as a particular type of criminal. The Whitechapel murders helped create that archetype. The unknown figure who kills multiple victims following a pattern, who taunts authorities, who becomes the subject of intense speculation and fear. The name itself, Jack the Ripper, was perfectly crafted for this purpose, memorable and sinister in equal measure. The case generated an entire industry of books, articles, theories, and investigations that continues to this day. People who dedicate themselves to researching the case are sometimes called Ripperologists, and they have produced an enormous body of work examining every aspect of the murders, the victims, the suspects, and the investigation. Some of this work is serious historical research. Some of it is sensationalist speculation. Much of it falls somewhere in between. Whitechapel itself changed dramatically in the decades following the murders. The worst of the slums were eventually cleared, replaced by new housing developments. Dorset Street, where Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly both lived, was demolished in the early 20th century. Many of the street names were changed. The area gradually gentrified, and today the East End is barely recognizable as the place it was in 1888. What was once considered the worst district in London has become in many areas quite expensive real estate. The murder sites themselves have become destinations for tourists. Walk-in tours take visitors to the approximate locations where the bodies were found, though the exact spots are often difficult to pinpoint due to street changes and redevelopment. Mitre Square still exists, though the buildings around it have changed. Bucks Row was renamed Durward Street. The courtyard where Elizabeth Stride died is now a parking lot. Miller's Court, where Mary Jane Kelly was killed, was demolished, and a small section of Dorset Street still exists but has been renamed. In various East London cemeteries, small memorials mark the graves of some of the victims. Mary Ann Nichols is buried in the City of London Cemetery. Annie Chapman lies there as well. Elizabeth Stride was laid to rest in East London Cemetery. Catherine Eddowes is in the City of London Cemetery. Mary Jane Kelly is buried in St. Patrick's Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. People visit these graves, leaving flowers, coins, and small tokens, remembering women they never knew, victims of crimes that occurred more than a century ago. The question of why the incidents stopped after Mary Jane Kelly remains a matter of speculation, with various theories proposed over the years. Perhaps the person responsible passed away, either by his own hand like Druitt, or from natural causes or accident. Perhaps he was institutionalized like Kosminski, his liberty curtailed before he could act again. Perhaps he emigrated, taking his violence to another country. Perhaps he was imprisoned for an unrelated offense. Perhaps he simply stopped, either because he had achieved whatever he sought or because he feared the increased police presence made continuing too risky. All of these are theories, and without knowing who was responsible, we cannot know which, if any, might be accurate. Some researchers argue that the pattern didn't actually stop, that other violent incidents in the area in 1889, 1890, and 1891 may have been the work of the same person, but were either not recognized as such or were different enough that police didn't connect them. Alice Mackenzie, found in July 1889, had injuries similar but less extensive than the canonical victims. Francis Coles, found in February 1891, had been attacked but showed a different pattern. Neither of these cases convinced the investigating officers that they were definitely connected to the canonical five, though opinions among the police at the time were divided. What we can say with certainty is that no incidents with the distinctive characteristics of the canonical five occurred after November 1888. Whatever else may have happened, whoever was responsible, the pattern of violence in Whitechapel that marked those autumn weeks had ended. The legacy of these events is a complicated thing. On one hand, the case represents a failure of justice. 5 women who lost their lives in violent circumstances, and the person responsible never caught, never identified. On the other hand, the case sparked genuine social change, forcing society to confront inequalities and conditions it had long ignored. The incidents became a turning point, a moment when the invisible poor became visible, when their lives suddenly mattered to people who had never before given them a thought. But there's a troubling aspect to the legacy as well. Over time, the focus of fascination has often centered on the unknown person responsible, their identity the great mystery, the violence the subject of endless speculation and analysis. The women, meanwhile, have sometimes been reduced to victims, defined entirely by how their lives ended rather than how they lived. The common assumption that they all engaged in street work, while likely accurate in most cases based on the evidence available, can reduce their identities to that single aspect of their existence, erasing the complexity of their lives, the struggles they faced, the choices they made in the absence of better options. Mary Ann Nichols was a mother of 5, separated from her children by circumstances and poverty. Annie Chapman was battling chronic illness, trying to earn a living through flower selling and needlework when her health allowed. Elizabeth Stride had emigrated from Sweden seeking a better life, had married, had stories to tell that may or may not have been entirely true. Catherine Eddowes had 3 children, had the initials of a man she cared for tattooed on her arm, had traveled to Kent to pick hops, and tried to make an honest living. Mary Jane Kelly was young, told stories about her past that may or may not have been accurate, sang songs in her room in Miller's Court. They were people, not just victims. They lived in an unjust world that offered them few choices and little mercy. They did what they had to do to survive, and when violence found them in the darkness, they had no one to protect them, no safety net to catch them. What happened to them was not inevitable, not the natural consequence of how they lived, despite what Victorian moralists might have suggested. They were victims of violence, and they deserve to be remembered as human beings, not as footnotes to a mystery. The fascination with Jack the Ripper shows no signs of diminishing. New books are published regularly, each claiming to have solved the mystery or to offer fresh insights. Documentaries explore the case from every possible angle. Fiction writers set novels and stories in the world of the Whitechapel murders, using the historical events as a backdrop for their invented narratives. The case has been analyzed through the lens of modern criminal profiling, with FBI investigators and forensic psychologists offering their theories about what type of person might have committed these crimes. Some of this work is valuable, genuine attempts to understand what happened and why, to bring modern analytical tools to bear on historical questions. But much of it feels exploitative, treating the murders as entertainment, the victims as props in a mystery game. There's a fine line between historical interest and morbid fascination, and the Jack the Ripper industry doesn't always respect that line. DNA analysis has been conducted on various items allegedly connected to the case, with mixed and controversial results. The shawl supposedly from Catherine Eddowes' murder, mentioned earlier, is just one example. Other items have been tested, with proponents claiming to have identified the killer and critics pointing out flaws in methodology, chain of custody issues, and the limitations of DNA evidence when dealing with items whose history cannot be reliably verified. Even if a DNA profile could be reliably extracted from evidence proven to have come from the crime scenes, Matching it to a specific individual would require having that individual's DNA for comparison, and most of the historical suspects are long dead with no preserved genetic material available. The truth is that some mysteries remain unsolved, not because the truth is hiding somewhere waiting to be discovered, but because the truth is simply lost to time. The identity of Jack the Ripper may be one of these. We may never know who killed those 5 women in the autumn of 1888, and at this distance, it's questionable whether learning the killer's identity would actually tell us anything meaningful. The societal factors that made the murders possible, the poverty and inequality that placed vulnerable women on dark streets with no protection, the investigative limitations of the era, the media circus that followed, these things we can understand and learn from. The inner workings of one killer's mind, assuming we could somehow access them across a gulf of more than a century, might offer less insight than we imagine. What we're left with is a moment in history when 5 women died terrible deaths, when a city confronted uncomfortable truths about itself, when the name Jack the Ripper entered the collective consciousness and never left. We're left with the knowledge that terrible things can happen in the darkness, that evil can go unpunished, that justice is not always served. We're left with questions that have no answers, and mysteries that may never be solved. The streets of Whitechapel are different now. They're well lit, busy with traffic, lined with shops and restaurants. Tourists walk where Mary Ann Nichols walked, though they don't necessarily realize it. The past is still there, if you know where to look, in the occasional old building that survived the redevelopment, in the street names that remain unchanged, in the cemeteries where the victims lie buried. On certain nights, when fog rolls in off the Thames and the modern world fades a little, you might imagine you can feel it. The weight of history, the echo of footsteps, the ghostly presence of 5 women who never got to grow old, never saw the world change, never knew that their names would be remembered long after they were gone. We remember them now, not as victims only, but as people. Mary Ann, who wore a new bonnet on the last night of her life. Annie, who crocheted flowers and sold them on street corners. Elizabeth, with her Swedish accent and her stories. Catherine, who had a man's initials tattooed on her arm. Mary Jane, who sang songs in her room. 5 women, 5 lives, 5 losses that shook a city and echoed through time. The case files remain open, officially, unsolved. The Metropolitan Police still, technically, are investigating, though of course no active work is being done on a case from 1888. Perhaps that's as it should be. Some wounds never fully heal. Some questions never find answers. Some ghosts never rest. If you stayed with me through this long night's journey into the past, I thank you. These stories, these forgotten lives, deserve to be told and remembered. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and what cases from the past speak to you most strongly. And if you'd like to continue exploring these shadowed corners of history, consider subscribing to The Velvet Obscura. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Until next time, when we open another case, I'll leave you with this thought. The past is never truly past. It lives on in the stories we tell, the questions we ask, the mysteries we can't solve. And sometimes in the early morning hours when the city is quiet and the fog is thick, the past feels very close indeed. Good night, and remember the forgotten.